Welcome back to China Notes. Today we'll talk about China's population. There are currently 1.4 billion people in mainland China. If Hong Kong, Macau, Taiwan, and overseas Chinese are included, there will be about 1.55 billion people in total. It accounts for 20% of the world's population of 7.5 billion. Due to the continuous low fertility rate, the population will only increase by around 50 million over the next 5 years. That is to say, around 2025, the global Chinese population will reach a peak of 1.6 billion, then it will begin to decrease slowly. Let's take a look at the historical trend of China's population. For an agricultural-based empire, the population is the dominant source of power to compete with its neighbors. So basically, all policies encourage childbearing. But influenced by wars and natural disasters, the population of ancient China showed wave-like growth. After the formation of a stable and unified empire in 202 BC, relatively reliable population statistics began to be recorded. The first population peak occurred around 0 AD with 65 million people, similar to the Roman Empire of the same period. These two empires each accounted for 20% of the world's population. But 200 years later, wars brought down the population by more than 2/3. After this, the same pattern continued. In periods of peace, the number of people rose, while in periods of war, the number of people fell. So there is a saying that goes, better to be a dog in times of peace than a man in times of trouble. The second population peak occurred around 1000 AD, when it exceeded 100 million. It rose further to 150 million in 1600. Then crops from America, such as potatoes, sweet potatoes, and corn, began to be popular in China. Although the proportion of these crops was not high at that time, they not only had high yield, but also had stronger adaptability to climate and land. As such, they greatly improved the stability of the food supply and alleviated the population loss during famines. As mentioned in the previous episode, when China reached the last dynasty, the Qing dynasty, it realized the integration of the nomads and the farming people on both sides of the Great Wall, resulting in fewer conflicts. Because of this, the grain output did not need to support a large number of troops. At the same time, the tax system had changed, and the basis of tax collection moved from population to land. That is to say, families no longer needed to pay more taxes to have more children. Both of these reasons resulted in more food surplus for farmers and a higher birth rate. In addition, crops from the Americas were further popularized. So during this period, the population of China expanded rapidly, and in 1850, it rose to more than 400 million. By 1949, when New China was founded, the population was more than 500 million. In a peaceful environment, basic medical care became widespread, a variety of epidemics had been eliminated, and the mortality rate of newborns was greatly reduced. In addition, the national mobilization of water conservancy projects and the development of chemical fertilizer led to a sharp increase of farmland production. So China's population began to explode, approaching 1 billion in 30 years. Since then, population growth has slowed down because of the improvement of women's education and family planning policy. It stood at over 1.2 billion in 2000. Due to the increasing pressure of aging, the family planning policy is gradually liberalized now. At present, China encourages a couple to have 2 children, but there are still restrictions on the 3rd child. If you look at the statistical chart of China's current population, you will be surprised by the huge fluctuations in the population of different age groups. There are 2 reasons. One is the Great Famine around 1960, the other is the one-child policy. From 1959 to 1962, China experienced one of the biggest mass famines in human history. There are many reasons for this, but the main reason is the overly radical industrialization. According to the census data of the Chinese government, about 17 million people died of famine. Even if all factors are taken into account, the number will not exceed 20 million. Because this famine was relatively recent, the number of abnormal deaths can be calculated for the current population distribution of different ages. However, if you search for data online, it could be as high as 30 million or even 40 million. This is the result of anti-communist propaganda for a long time. The decline in the number of births is counted as the number of deaths. Similar to the famine in Ukraine around 1933, rigorous calculations will not exceed 3 million, but some people claim 7 million or even 10 million. There are always politicians who manipulate history for their own benefit. Considering that China's population base was 660 million at that time, the peak of mortality rate was about 25 per thousand in 1960. In fact, before 1949, the mortality rate of China's population was higher than that nearly every year. Another comparison is with India. The mortality curve in India is smooth, and mortality rate is much higher than that in China, except in 1960. In 1958, before the famine, China's mortality rate had already reached the level that India's was in 1980. But in any case, the famine was a humanitarian disaster. The discussion and accountability of the famine were also the main reasons for China's violent political turmoil in the Mao Zedong era. Let's talk about the one-child policy. In fact, as early as the 1950s, the Chinese government began to plan a mild family planning policy, but it was not effectively implemented because labor power was the only available resource in China at that time. After the reform and opening up, the government began to realize the seriousness of the problem, especially the pressure of employment and food supply. Accordingly, the family planning policy became what we now know as the one-child policy. If a local official was not up to the standard on the family planning work, all his or her other political achievements would not be recognized. Therefore, at the grassroots level, there are many cases of harsh law enforcement, such as forced abortion and asset seizing. Of course, you can accuse China of harming human rights because India's family planning policy is not compulsory. However, India has 50% more arable land than China, so there is more policy space. And, like the previous chart, India's mortality rate remained higher than China's until 2010 when the rates converged. Finally, India's family planning policy is not relatively strict. This is not so much a consideration of human rights as it's a result of the lack of executive power of the government. It's quite obvious that for a country with a large population and limited resources, if the reproductive right is not limited, there is no way to guarantee an improvement in the standard of living. A large number of people are unable to participate in industrial production due to insufficient education is one of the main reasons for India's failure to compete with China. Even to this day, India is still unable to solve the problem of malnutrition of hundreds of millions of children. In 2007, China's official statement was that 400 million fewer children were born due to family planning. But it may not be appropriate to attribute all the decline in fertility to family planning policies, because other East Asian countries that did not implement strict family planning policies also experienced a sharp decline in fertility after the 1980s. Regardless, the one-child policy has alleviated the pressure of poverty eradication in China to a certain extent. Nowadays, many developing countries in the world are undergoing a population explosion. China's experience can be used as a valuable reference for them. The ancient Chinese Empire was always a patriarchal society. At that time, the most important thing for a regime was agricultural production and war, both of which required physical strength. As a result, men had the right to inheritance and were responsible for supporting the elderly. A woman was subordinate to her husband's family after marriage, and would have a low social position unless she had a son. This kind of long-term inequality of social and economic status has caused the cultural phenomenon of preference for men over women, which still affects China. This kind of influence makes the ratio of men and women unbalanced in China today, and it's obvious in places where Confucian culture is more developed. The one-child policy exacerbates this imbalance because parents are more likely to let a girl miscarry. According to the data in 2018, the total gender ratio of the Chinese mainland is about 105. That is, there are 105 men per 100 women. The ratio of male to female newborns is even greater, with a peak of 120 in 2009. As a result, there are 30 million more men than women in the current population. This is a great challenge to social security, for example, the problem of human trafficking. Therefore, long history has left behind a rich heritage, but it is also a heavy burden. The reason why China after 1949 is called New China is because of its critical attitudes towards many traditional cultures. One of the most important pieces of progress of New China is women's liberation. As early as 1954, equal pay for equal work was written into the first constitution. Not to mention the famous slogan coined by Chairman Mao, "Women can hold up half the sky." Another major effect of the family planning policy is that the education level of women has been greatly improved, because as the only child in the family, both boys and girls shoulder the responsibility of changing their family's fate through education. Nowadays, with the low proportion of female newborns, the number of female students in China's higher education is greater than that of male students. In fact, the inequality in China's development is particularly obvious in areas of women's development. In underdeveloped areas, girls may need to start working early to support their brother's education. But on the other hand, of the 100 most successful self-made female billionaire entrepreneurs in the world, 60 are Chinese women. There are 56 ethnic groups in China, of which the proportion of Han is about 90%, and is slowly decreasing. All along, family planning policies for ethnic minorities have been more relaxed. After all, the population of some ethnic groups is very small and shouldn't be allowed to decrease further. Another reason is that if one of the parents is a minority, children prefer to register as a minority, because they can enjoy more preferential policies. The most important policy is to add points to the college entrance examination. That is to say, if you are a minority, you can go to a better university with the same score. In China, especially in the areas where the Han is the main body, people's behavior towards ethnic minorities is more curious and excited than discriminatory. From 1949 to today, China's urbanization rate has risen from 10% to 60%. But because China has been implementing the household registration policy, only about 45% of the population has an urban residence permit. The remaining 15% are migrant workers and their families who contribute labor to the city but cannot enjoy the public service and social security of the city. This problem has been widely criticized. Because of this, there are many rural children whose parents work in cities far away and meet only once a year during the Spring Festival holiday. This will naturally affect children's physical and mental health. This family separation is the most common social tragedy in China. In the wave of urbanization, how to manage the decline of rural areas is one of the most important problems facing China. According to the current low fertility rate, the population of the Chinese mainland will be less than the India population at the latest in 2027. At present, many experts are discussing how to encourage fertility and prevent the population from aging too fast. Experts warn many provinces are already run out of pensions because of a shortage of labor and a large number of retirees. Other experts think that China's population is already very large. A smaller population will make the country's per capita resources more abundant. As for the pension problem, it can be solved by the policy reform and technology. For ordinary young people working in cities, the common complaint is that it's too expensive to have a child. Thanks for watching. Now we've set the tone with 3 episodes. We can finally talk about why China's economy has been booming. I'll see you next time.